Welcome to the debate. This is part 2 of 3 from our book breakdown series on the 48 laws of power.
We are diving deep into the core mechanics of power this time, focusing intensely on laws 17 through 32. The section deals squarely with, well, the manipulative middle game, strategic deception, calculated invisibility, and the meticulous management of appearance. It's really where the gloves come off.
Absolutely. We move past basic reputation and into proactive psychological warfare. And the central question we're facing is, I think, a critical one. Does the commitment to these covert strategies, things like manufacturing choice, cultivating unpredictability, or, leveraging mass fantasy, does that provide the ultimate indispensable path to dominating your rivals?
I'm going to argue they represent these indispensable, almost sophisticated tools for long-term control, specifically because they remove genuine agency from the opposition.
And I guess I come at it from a very different way. I challenge the fundamental sustainability of these laws. They depend entirely on maintaining a fragile, exhaustive illusion. I see them as dangerously fragile facades that invariably lead to exposure and just catastrophic downfall. Power built on deception, no matter how elegant it looks, is just structurally unsound.
See, I think these laws are the playbook for active strategic dominance. The aim is no longer just surviving the court, it's achieving total psychological control over your environment. The most potent power, as the ideal of the perfect courtier in Law 24 suggests, is acquired through indirection. You maintain this appearance of being civilized, decent and fair, even democratic, while secretly being the consummate manipulator. You train yourself to be indirect. And the real stroke of genius here lies in Law 31, control the options. By giving your victims choices, all of which ultimately favor your goals, you eliminate resistance because they believe they acted autonomously. The victim feels powerful because they made a decision, but they are simply choosing between favorable paths you pre-selected.
Okay, but I'm sorry. I just don't buy that the foundation of long-term power can be built so overwhelmingly on such fragile illusions. Law 5 established that reputation is the cornerstone of power, right? So any strategy built on deception, especially playing on mass fantasies, Law 27, is essentially a ticking clock. The public or the target, they might relish the temporary dream you're selling them, but the moment that lie is discovered, their opinion turns instantly. They shift from worship to fury, and they just stand aside and let public opinion execute the deceiver. And what's more, the perfect courtier, who is so indirect and subtle, faces massive risks. Law 24 warns that if you flaunt your achievements too much or stir up envy, you invite treachery and backstabbing. The sheer level of caution required to placate every single peer who might someday harm you makes that kind of dominating control impossible to maintain without constant fear of exposure.
I see why you think that, focusing on the public backlash, but let me offer a different perspective. Let's focus on the tactical precision and the psychological mechanism of control. Law 31 isn't about obvious trickery. It's about mastery by coloring the choices, a technique favored heavily by Henry Kissinger in his maneuvering with President Nixon. It's not about forcing an outcome. It's about controlling the entire decision-making framework.
Could you elaborate on that mechanism, though? Because to the average person, coloring the choices sounds like this incredibly complicated political maneuvering that must require just a tremendous amount of energy.
It does, but it saves energy in the long run by eliminating conflict. Kissinger would often ensure that the initial set of options presented to the president contained 2 or 3 obviously disastrous paths, alongside one path that was maybe a little less palatable, but aligned with Kissinger's own preferred outcome. So this approach bypasses the messy, direct arguments that Law 9 warns against. The superior, they feel they've conducted a rigorous decision process. They select the least bad option, which, unbeknownst to them, was the one you wanted all along. They convince themselves, which removes the need for you to convince them. And that eliminates resistance because the opponent truly believes they exercised free will.
That's a compelling argument on the elegance of Law 31, I'll give you that. But this level of manipulation demands almost omniscience, and that is exactly where the fragility lies. Law 29 dictates that you must plan all the way to the end. The complexity of mapping out every single contingency, of knowing your enemy's thumbscrew from Law 19 and their specific emotional triggers, is debilitating. The moment a fundamental deception is revealed, the margin for error is zero, and the collapse it's spectacular. I mean, just consider the case of I. Bragadino, the alchemist in 16th century Venice.
Bragadino was a master of the theatrical lie, absolutely.
He was, but he illustrates the fatal flaw of building power on Law 27, playing on mass fantasy. He promised the Venetian senators he could turn base metals into gold, leveraging their greed and their hope. He staged a demonstration using a glass pipe concealed in his sleeve to make it appear he had multiplied gold. The fantasy worked until the public demanded delivery. When he failed to produce and his deception was exposed, while the lies simply ran out of time. A powerful figure cannot sustain a lie when belief wanes. The Venetians, humiliated, reacted with fury, not just disappointment. They executed him publicly. The fantasy is exposed, the trust is obliterated, and the angry crowd consumes the deceiver.
But sometimes, the mechanism of deception works precisely because the lie is more palatable than the truth. Law 27 shows that the public is starving for myth and enigma. We secretly crave things that can't be instantly interpreted, and the larger the group, the easier it is to deceive, making them easier targets than an individual who might be more critical. The power is not just in the lie itself, but in generating the fantasy, drawing people in like a magnet because they seek that temporary diversion from brutal reality.
That temporary diversion is exactly the problem. It's temporary. If the goal is long-term dominance, you can't rely on fleeting public emotion. The necessity of maintaining that illusion, it leads us directly into the issue of cultivated appearance, which requires this constant taxing performance.
And that brings us to the importance of appearance and pace, specifically cultivating unpredictability with Law 17 and making one's work seem effortless with Law 30.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because cultivating an air of utter unpredictability only increases suspicion, not respect. If you make a show of effortlessness, you invite constant scrutiny about what deep, ugly toil you are concealing. If the court suspects you are constantly scheming, you'll be viewed as untrustworthy and dangerously volatile. And furthermore, Law 17, this idea of keeping people on their toes, it often clashes with Law 16, which requires using absence to increase respect. If you're constantly circulating, constantly performing the unpredictable genius, your value decreases. The vigilance required to maintain this facade is exhaustive and fundamentally unsustainable. You're always playing a part, which inevitably leads to burnout or a slip-up.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Effortlessness is power because it creates awe and denies your rivals a target. The master artist, Kano Tanyu, is a perfect historical example of Law 30 in practice. He created these magnificent sketches for gold screens, seemingly in a moment, raising his standing by concealing the tremendous preparatory work that went into them. This deception serves a psychological purpose. If you see someone accomplish something seemingly without effort, you're intimidated. You assume they're working on a different plane, and you deny yourself the time gap needed for doubt to spring up.
I fail to see how concealing work prevents doubt. It just breeds suspicion. If you can't show the necessary steps, people assume you cut corners or use deceit.
Not if the execution is flawless and fast. Law 28 says you must enter action with boldness. Speed and apparent effortlessness, they work together to destroy the time and mental space required for rivals to mobilize or for critics to analyze your methods. The performance of flawless, instantaneous execution elevates you above the fray. It isn't just about looking busy, it's about intimidating opponents and denying them a foothold for attack.
But look at the sheer penalty for misalignment, which is so often far greater than the reward. If your dazzling actions draw too much attention, especially if you accidentally outshine the master, a direct violation of Law 1, the consequences are immediate and severe. Consider Lola Montes, a master of attracting attention. When she drew the disapproval of the royal couple at a public event, they deliberately avoided looking at her box. It was a subtle but profound signal. Subsequently, no one in fashionable society dared to be seen with her.
And Law 1 is paramount. But that's an argument for precision in applying the laws, not against the laws themselves. Montez failed to read the social temperature. The brilliance of Law 24, the perfect courtier, is precisely that it teaches you the necessary balance to achieve dominance while maintaining a humble and useful appearance.
But this pursuit of indirection, this ultimate goal of the courtier, it's often more dangerous than direct action. I mean, why rely on a fragile cat's paw when your hand should be clean by default?
Because indirection is essential for thriving in the modern court, where everything must appear civilized, decent, democratic, and fair. If we play too strictly by those rules, taking them literally, we get crushed by those who understand the reality of power. We have to take the indirect route. The art of the courtier demands this tactical maneuvering, because if you do the ugly task, eliminating a rival, seizing funds, you must use a cat's paw, an intermediary, to keep the blood off your own hands. This insulation protects your reputation, allowing you to maintain that veneer of decency from Law 5 while achieving brutal ends.
And I just don't buy that it guarantees success or safety. The risk is that the power of deception and indirection rests entirely outside the manipulator. It's subject to the whims and insecurities of the master or the masses. This dependence it's highly changeable.
But if the action is successful, the cat's paw takes the blame. Or you use an enemy as a cat's paw to ensure their downfall is simultaneous with the execution of the task. That is efficiency.
That is high-stakes maneuvering that often backfires. I mean, look at the fate of Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances under Louis XIV. Fouquet was a master of the grand spectacle, seeking to impress the king, but in doing so, he violated Law 1 by showing too much opulence and power. He hosted a magnificent fête for the king at his chateau, where the display of wealth rivaled the royal palace itself.
It was a catastrophic overstep.
Exactly. And even though some of his stealing of funds was arguably done on the king's behalf and he was using indirection, the fragility of a master's favor led to his total destruction. Louis XIV's insecurity was immediately triggered. He had Fouquet arrested 3 months later by D'Artagnan, and the man spent 20 years in solitary confinement. Fouquet's indirection and his impressive network were completely useless the moment the true source of power, the king's ego, was threatened. The power of the courtier is only as stable as the master they serve.
But the Fouquet case teaches us the necessity of controlling options in managing perception, not the failure of the strategy itself. Fouquet failed to manage the king's insecurity. The successful application of laws 17 through 32 ensures you never present a psychological target like Fouquet did. You maintain your distance, you cultivate mystique, and you ensure that when choices are presented, the decision-maker remains convinced of your utility, even if you are being deceptive.
I maintain that the exhaustion and the sheer risk of misalignment inherent in these laws, from constantly performing unpredictability to flawlessly executing grand deceptions, make them tools of immediate tactical gain, but ultimate strategic fragility. The cost of maintaining the facade always outweighs the benefit.
These laws provide a robust handbook on the arts of indirection and psychological leverage. By mastering these tools, controlling the options, concealing your toil, cultivating unpredictability, one can maintain power for decades, appearing the paragon of decency while being the consummate manipulator. It is the ultimate playbook for dominating competitors long-term by appealing to the public's necessary love of myth and enigma.
And while the potential for immediate, dazzling control is evident, the reliance on sustaining illusions and diverting resentment is just fundamentally risky and, as history shows us time and again, unsustainable. Those who build their power solely on deception and fantasy, ignoring the need for robust, long-term stability and genuine influence, well, they are the ones who face the most spectacular and painful downfalls when the crowd or the master finally sees through the act.
We have explored the high stakes involved in deploying laws 17 through 32. Detailing how the pursuit of dominance through sophisticated deception invites corresponding and often catastrophic risks of public ruin if misapplied.
Yeah, the core lesson of this section, I think, is that power is ultimately a performance, But whether that performance can be sustained is the difference between ruling for a lifetime and suffering a very rapid downfall.
Join us for part 3 of our book breakdown, where we will examine laws 33 through 48, discussing how to master timing, crush your enemies, and assume formlessness.
Subscribe now so you don't miss the conclusion to this essential breakdown.